Okay, so welcome to our second section of Unit 1 APUSH regarding early colonial developments into the Americas, going from 1607, the establishment of Jamestown, to 1754, the start of the Seven Years' War. The first four countries that we want to talk about in APUSH are the Spanish, French, English, and Dutch, because these are the four main colonial empires that colonized much of the Americas. To begin, we can obviously see from this graph that the goals are very similar. It's primarily wealth, trade, and the accumulation of goods for the mother country. And by looking at the rest of these, we see immigration, population settlement being primarily different, with Spain and England prioritizing larger mixed families to settle these new areas, whereas the French and Dutch preferred smaller groups that mainly focused on merchants and trading. Religion is another one, the French and Spanish being Catholic and the English and Dutch being Protestant. This happened because of a series of conflicts and wars in Europe that we'll learn in AP Euro. Not really important for APUSH right now. Economy. This is primarily based on each country's geographical area that was settled and relationship with natives. The Spanish want to subjugate and conquer them, as Cortez did in the Aztecs, Pizarro for the Incas. The French more so rather wanted to cooperate with them, the English to expel them, and the Dutch to cooperate. Now, this is a map of the early 13 colonies in America. Something to keep in mind that Britain or England was not the first country to settle this area, as two other major European countries also did the same, one of which is the Dutch, the Netherlands, who actually settled in modern day New York City, then called New Amsterdam, which was later taken over by the English after a series of wars. The other country, less important but still a fun trivial fact, is Sweden, colonizing much of modern day Delaware and calling it New Sweden, with Fort Christina being its capital before being eventually taken over by England, which later then established the 13 colonies that we know today. The 13 colonies are divided into the southern colonies, the middle colonies, and the New England colonies. These will all be distinctive regional identities that will be maintained up until the Civil War. On the top left, we see a graph of the approximate number of settlers in North American colonies, where we see the English having a substantially larger number than the French, Dutch, and Spanish because of the large amount of immigration to the New World, whether that be actually being primarily from religious purposes, such as the Puritans and Pilgrims. So let's compare the New England, Middle, and Chesapeake colonies. These are all very distinct and each important to the APUSH curriculum. So for New England, this was a place primarily settled by Puritans, Pilgrims. The Puritan city on a hill was basically the Puritans saying that they wanted a perfect society for themselves, a city on a hill. The Pilgrims, Mayflower Compact, all those for religious purposes. However, unlike the Chesapeake and Middle colonies, the terrain was much more rocky. The soil was not good at all for farming, and as a result, they relied less on farming for goods, whereas the Chesapeake and Middle colonies more so cultivated cash crops, which kept their economy afloat. And because of that, slaves were utilized more in the southern colonies as compared to the northern ones. That's why slavery became widespread in the South. Some key events in the New England colonies include the Salem witch trials and King Philip's War. In the South, we also see the same conflict with Bacon's Rebellion. The New England economy was mainly based on fishing, shipbuilding, trade, because that was what they could do in the North with lots of trees, good for shipbuilding and good for fishing as compared to the South, which exported tons of cash crops such as tobacco, the main one, as well as indigo, rice, and lumber. And as we see, the labor that was primarily used in these southern colonies were indentured servants, enslaved Africans. Indentured servants were the main force of labor up until events such as Bacon's Rebellion began, which really decreased the usage of the indentured servants, and it was later replaced by enslaved Africans. So here is another map showing the economic products of the colonies and the ethnic makeup of the colonies, which we can see the spread of Africans in the south and north, mainly English, Dutch, Swedish. Oh, here is a section on Metacomb, known to Europeans as King Philip's War. This was the final resistance and defeat of New England Native Americans in New England, where basically the it was basically caused by land disputes between English colonists who wanted to expand their territory, which reduced the hunting and planting grounds of the Wampanoag people and their allies. This eventually led to conflict, increased tensions between the two states, and eventually ended in the defeat of the natives and further expansion of England into New England. Here is another graphic portraying the makeup of African Americans in the 13 colonies. We can see the massive imports of African Americans, specifically throughout the 1700s, because of the necessity of labor to pick crops in the deep south, especially with the role that cash crops played in their economy. It became necessary for the South to maintain slaves in order to keep up with the demand for cash crops. We see this less in the North because of there being less of a reliability on cash crops and more so on shipbuilding or fishing. Now, Bacon's Rebellion. So Bacon's Rebellion was a rebellion in the South. It began in Virginia, where the English governor, William Berkeley, drove the frontier settlers' frustrations due to there being a lack of protection from Native American attacks and there being corruption from the elite, which united both poor whites and black laborers and ended up burning cities such as Jamestown. However, following Nathaniel Bacon's death due to dysentery, it caused the rebellion to collapse, yet it still showed the weakness in the colonial government's makeup. However, it still represented the importance of the lower classes, especially indentured servitude, which is why indentured servants became less of a mainstream thing, with slavery replacing it. Stonewall Rebellion was the largest British colonial slave rebellion, which once again demonstrates the usage of violence in the 13 colonies and the role of slaves in it. The triangular slave trade was a trading network set between Africa, North America, and Europe, which basically traded raw materials, manufactured goods, and slaves. This was how the 13 colonies exported their goods to Europe and how they received slaves from Africa. An important term to understand is mercantilism, which is a European economic policy that was key to a country's power, specifically from the 1500s to the 1700s. Its main goal was to create favorable balance of trade and self-sufficiency. And what it basically did was it said that the main purpose of a colony was to strengthen and enrich the mother country. to that, the 13 colonies, is to England, which is basically how the 13 colonies, which is basically why the 13 colonies had a role in exporting so many goods to England because of the policy of mercantilism that the English had set up. Mercantilism was a policy that was founded by French minister Colbert and was key in Adam Smith's 1776 work, The Wealth of a Nation, which all worked to strengthen the foundation of mercantilism in foreign trade. Yeah. The Navigations Act of 1651. This was basically a British Parliament law that enforced mercantilism into the American colonies to basically say that they had to trade exclusively with Britain using British ships in order to boost national wealth. These acts restricted colonial exports to other countries and forced imports through Britain, which caused widespread smuggling and colonial resentment. However, due to there being several wars that England have fought with countries such as France and Spain throughout this time period, this Navigations Act was never really enforced, which caused many colonists to perform salutary neglect that will become more apparent in the decades to follow. Another main factor that came into play throughout this period was First Enlightenment in the 1700s, which basically was an intellectual movement that focused on reason, liberty, progress, and the science, which challenged the traditional religious and economic and political ideas. This was a phenomenon that was primarily driven by intense patriotism, economic incentives, and social pressures. One thing that came from this was John Locke's natural rights and his social contract. Social contract basically being that it was the central government's role, England's role, to look out for the people in the colonies, and if they do that, then the colonists will obey the England. However, if the social contract is not maintained, then the colonists have every right to declare independence and rebel. This comes with the idea of democracy and the importance of free speech and religious tolerance, which also took place in this era, that will shape the foundations of America in its founding in 1776.
Welcome to
The First Great Awakening was a part of the wider free religious phenomenon that came during this period, which was basically a period of intense Protestant revivalism in the American colonies, which emphasized personal faith, emotional conversion, and piety over formal ritual. This movement was led by important people such as George Whitefield and Jonathan Edwards that promoted evangelicalism and created a common unifying experience across the colonies, which resulted in increased religious tolerance, diversity, and a question of authority that will continue to be maintained up until the Revolutionary War. And that's all we have time for today. Thank you for listening. This was our last chapter on Unit 1, and the next video we will be starting Unit 2. So, yeah, thanks for watching, guys.